Welcome to 3dmotive.com. My name is Ricardo Rambarran, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to use some modifiers in 3ds Max to make low poly meshes from high poly ones that you may have had in ZBrush or even in Max itself. This is a great tutorial for anyone who's looking for alternatives to using ZBrush to decimate, or if you're working in 3ds Max and you want to stay in 3ds Max. So the first thing, before we get into it, is to understand that 3ds Max has three different ways of decimating their meshes. There's the older version, which is called Optimize, the semi-newer version called Multires, and the newest version called Pro-Optimizer. And I'll briefly go through the last two to show you how they work and the benefits of using something in 3ds Max versus ZBrush. So the first step was I imported my mesh into 3ds Max, and this is a high poly mesh that I worked on in ZBrush. As you can see, the poly count is over 1 million. So in my case, I need to decimate it to about maybe 100 to 200 polys. So once I import it, I go into the modifier list. The first modifier I'll apply will be the multi-res. So once I apply the multi-res, the next step you need to do is generate. Once you click on generate, it'll calculate what it needs to be able to work on the mesh in real time. I went ahead and already did the calculations to avoid the time it takes. So let me just hide this here. So here's the mesh with the multi-res on, and I already brought the vertex count down to 102. So as you can see, the poly count is already at 182 from the initial 1 million plus. So what this means is now basically I can work in real time on my mesh. And this versus ZBrush allows me to see in real time the changes that I'm affecting on my mesh, to see where the mesh is more dense, to see exactly what I'm getting as a result without having to calculate every time. This is great for anybody who's working on a smaller mesh but still needs to optimize it and still needs to go through the steps. So as you can see, your control is very limited with the multi-res, because like I mentioned before, the multi-res was the second iteration of the tool that Autodesk decided to release. So the next one I'll show you is the Pro-Optimizer, which is the newest of the modifiers that they released. It looks pretty much the same as you can see here, but if you take a look, you have much more control over the mesh itself. The same idea stays true. You still need to calculate your mesh, and it will go through the computation necessary to work on your mesh in real time, so that all stays true. However, what's slightly different about this, or one of the slightly different things, is that you have these optimization modes here. As you can see here, there's three different ones. There's crunch borders, protect borders, and exclude. What they essentially do is they look at the edge of your mesh and they try to find borders on the mesh, and it'll apply these parameters to it. So in this case, I clicked on protect borders. So what that means is that it will not affect anything at the borders. It won't collapse them, it won't exclude them, it will literally just keep the mesh as is, which oftentimes is going to be the case for when you're optimizing your mesh. If you click on crunch borders, it will essentially bring all these vertices into one point in the middle, and if you exclude them, it will simply not take them into consideration. However, there will be a lot more cutting in your mesh. You'll see a lot more holes throughout the sides. So what else you can work on is your materials and UVs. So that's one of the benefits, as I mentioned before, of working in 3ds Max versus in ZBrush, is that if you already had an unwrap on a mesh and you needed to lower the resolution, 3ds Max will conserve your unwraps and it'll conserve your materials that you applied. So that's a great advantage for somebody who's already in Max and has already done the unwraps. You don't have to redo all the work again, and you don't have to depend on ZBrush or even unwrapping it yourself again. As you can see, there's many more tools in the Pro-Optimizer, and they all give you control over the mesh, which is a great way to make lower poly meshes from higher poly ones, and at the same time preserve any UVs that you may have worked on, any materials that you may have worked on, and especially if you're already in Max, it helps you continue to work in the software. The other thing I want to show you is a quick way to get rid of some of the triangles that may be in your mesh. And this is a great tip for anybody who's importing from UDK, since UDK oftentimes triangulates a lot of the meshes. So what you want to do is, if for example you're working on a multi-res with an edit poly under, I'm just going to apply another edit poly over that to get access to the polygon modeling tools here. Once I've done that, I can go into geometry and click on Quadra File. Once I click on Quadra File, it will try to look for where there are too many triangles and essentially just turn them into quads. So if I go back, you'll see that there were triangles pretty much everywhere, and as you know, that they could be unnecessary depending on what you're working on. So once you hit on Quadra File, they all go away, and it gives you a much easier mesh to work from now. You'll be able to clean it up much easier, you'll be able to work with it, and it tends to be a little bit friendlier in the event you need to go into ZBrush again. So these are some great tools that you can use as alternatives to ZBrush, or if you're someone who really likes to work into 3ds Max and you generally want to stay in one software at a time. These are two easiest ways I've found to decimate high poly meshes, especially organic ones, to get the results you're looking for, as well as preserve any materials you may have applied to your mesh. Thank you for watching 3dmotive.com, and check back for more great tutorials.